Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're taking a look at the brand new, just announced upcoming addition to the Total War franchise, Total War Saga, Troy. While a leak earlier this year made it more or less blatantly obvious what was coming next for the Total War franchise, we now have a ton of actual, concrete information to comb through. We'll be looking at the campaign map, the details posted on Steam, the FAQ, all the information that I could find, across multiple websites on the internet, and we'll also be doing a touch of speculation here and there. But first, let's take a look at the trailer.
Rage, goddess. Sing of the rage of Peleus' son, Achilles. Murderous. Doomed. The children of men, but as leaves that drop at the wind's breath.
There's a lot to take away from the trailer, and with the Steam page not giving away too much detail, there's naturally room for speculation, which I love to do. A few things we do know from the Steam page are that the game will explore the conflict from both Greek and Trojan perspectives, and that we're going to have a character-led narrative drama. I don't think either of these things are surprising, but I will say I'm glad to hear the latter. I really enjoyed the way characters were made front and center with three kingdoms, and it sounds like more of the same here. More on that in a bit. Let's dissect the trailer first. I should mention, by the way, I'm quite likely to butcher some names here and there, and I apologize for that ahead of time. Feel free to correct me in the comments, as always. Now, our opening shot shows a beautiful vase painted with the black figure technique. I imagine this will be the storytelling medium for cutscenes, much like, yes, the Disney Hercules movie, though perhaps with less song and dance and comedy. It might also be the style with which units and building icons are made. I think the whole user interface, in fact, will be inspired by this very iconic art style. I am all for it. Back on topic, this particular illustration depicts Achilles mourning the loss of Patroclus. The two were good friends, and by some accounts from later authors, they were lovers. Whether their relationship was platonic, romantic, or otherwise, at the end of the day, the death of Patroclus was an important turning point for Achilles and the war as a whole. Now, as for the stories, Patroclus dies by the gates of Troy, so if the game starts before or right at the start of the Trojan War, I'd expect him to be included in some way or another. However, much like Thrones of Britannia started well into the Viking invasion of the British Isles, it's possible that we're going to start in the middle of the Trojan War, after this crucial event. We've been told that there are only 8 heroes, 4 per side. Achilles and Odysseus have been mentioned a few times, which leaves only 2 spots left for the Greek side, and that sounds fairly limiting, though I imagine DLC and FLC, if the game is successful and popular, will buff up those numbers a little bit. Either way, it sounds like these heroes are faction leaders, so it's very likely that Patroclus will be excluded. I keep pronouncing his name in different ways. I'm sorry. I just don't know how to get it right. Now, it's possible that these other legendary characters will be included in some other ways. There are so many, after all. Diomedes, Ajax the Great, Ajax the Lesser, Philoctetes, and of course, Agamemnon and Menelaus are all names that come to mind as key characters off the top of my head, alongside Achilles and Odysseus, who we've already seen. Enough time spent on literally the first shot. Let's move on. Now we see a fairly large battle taking place just outside Troy. Now these trailers are rarely indicative of actual army and unit sizes, but hopefully we're going to see something like the extreme size option in Three Kingdoms. The game is built on the Warhammer 2 engine, which did get the laboratory integration, so maybe that's also indicative of support for larger armies. Either way, we're seeing units of vastly different sizes, and we're also seeing, well, I'm not sure what these two lines are, but they are distinctly separate from the units around them. Something to keep in mind of this era is that formation fighting, outside of like unit per unit basis, wasn't established as far as we know, so I'm curious to see how that gets implemented and integrated. We also have these tiny units here, and all the units are actually of different sizes, but again, it's not gameplay footage, so really all this could mean absolutely nothing. What we do know from the FAQ is that there is a strong infantry versus infantry focus in combat. There are supposedly great differences in speed and mass between light, medium, and heavy infantry, and the new active and passive abilities should make combat fairly dynamic. Examples we were given include elite defensive warriors that are immune to flanking, or elite assault units that are expert flankers with better flanking effects. Cavalry wasn't a common sight in this time period, and most horses were used for chariots. While we don't see any chariots in the battle in this trailer, we do see them in some screenshots we'll go over in a bit, though perhaps they'll maybe be a rare commodity. Now, some heavier units will be slowed down by mud, others will be able to hide in tall grass, and some will stow away their shields when charging, an action that probably reduces ranged block chances but increases charge bonuses. So it's an interesting bit of decision-making to be had, perhaps, and I'm very curious again to see how different units maybe exist in different states, much like some of the units from Three Kingdoms had different formations they could take on for specific scenarios. I wonder if we'll see more of that being explored in Troy. Unit variety is going to be a challenge for Troy. After all, it's a saga game, and they're supposed to have a smaller scope. Hopefully the tactical implications of the different unit types is enough to set the factions apart on the battlefield. I do like how they plan on integrating slightly more mythical elements, and there's definitely room for variety there. For example, we're going to see minotaurs in the game, but they're not actual minotaurs, they're big, burly men in terrifying costumes. So I'm curious to see how else the game keeps things fresh on the battlefield. There's this whole element of truth behind the myth, I believe they're calling it. That's a core pillar of Total War Saga Troy, and that's something that's got me most intrigued from everything I've seen and heard. But more on that as we go along. Now here, we see Achilles in a bit of a rampage, slaughtering soldiers like a Romance of the Three Kingdoms character might. In Three Kingdoms, we saw how the loss of a loved one resulted in rampaging, so the focus on this aspect in the trailer makes me wonder if we'll see something similar to that here. After all, a character-led approach would perhaps imply a focus on relationships. He calls out to Hector, who is gearing up, and he's one of the Trojan heroes, of course, and this might be a nod to an ancillary system like Three Kingdoms, or perhaps a nod to unique items that certain characters will have, and then the two duke it out. Duels are back in Troy, but they're executed a little differently than Three Kingdoms, from the sounds of it. While heroes are able to challenge each other to a duel that takes place in an interruption-free circular zone, like in Three Kingdoms, the difference here is that heroes are able to disengage without penalty. It's a curious change. Why remove the penalty? What comes in its place? Did the penalty system not work all that great, or is this just a result of it being the Warhammer 2 engine? Was it easier to execute and implement this way? And is this a hint of what we might see in Warhammer 3? Who knows? Saga games, again, are a bit of an offshoot thing, so they might be using prior technology because of how they're developed. It's all speculation over here. Either way, when they're dueling, the heroes fight in matched animations, and I'm sure there are ample amounts of epic moments to be captured here. As for Achilles' rampage itself, that is quite possibly a reflection of his hot blood ability. Each of the 8 heroes have 2 abilities each, and Hot Blood is the one that reflects Achilles' Rage, an ability that supposedly increases his damage output while hurting the production capabilities of settlements under his command. Rock Paper Shotgun also mentions that if Achilles is insulted, he'll suffer penalties, but his units, the Myrmidons, will fight harder to cheer him up. His Greatest Warrior mechanic, meanwhile, pushes him to seek out other enemy generals that might threaten his status as the world's greatest warrior. Doing so reduces the cost of units, increases the loyalty of troops, and opens up diplomatic options. So, it sounds like these abilities, as well as diplomatic interactions, will have an impact on the campaign map as well as on the battlefield. If that's the case, I think it'll make for an interesting decision-making process, one where you have to consider buffs and debuffs to battle and campaign alike, meaning more long-term impact from these decisions. Now, with regards to campaign, well, let's take a moment to look at the campaign map.
In this age of myth, heroes walk the earth. Yet it takes only a single impulsive act to spark a conflict that will shake the world. Audacious Paris, Prince of Troy, takes beautiful Helen from her palace in Sparta. As they sail away, Helen's husband, King Menelaus, curses her name. He will bring his errant wife home, whatever the cost. King Agamemnon, wide ruling lord of finely walled Mycenae, hears his brother's call. He summons Achaean heroes from far and wide. Among them, swift-footed Achilles and Odysseus of the silver tongue. All mortals' thoughts turn towards the high peak of fog-shrouded Olympus. Even warriors marching to war and slaughter must seek the favor of the gods. While Paris and Helen flee east to Troy, a formidable Achaean army musters in the west. As Hector greets Paris at the gates of Troy, a wind from the west raises the dust at his feet. He looks to his brother and asks, "What have you done?"
Homer is our narrator in the campaign, which is certainly a nice touch, and we touch on a few important points here. Again, lots of it is speculation. The first island we fly across, Crete, I believe, looks like it has 8 settlements alone. I imagine we're going to see provinces with major and minor settlements, similar to Three Kingdoms and Thrones of Britannia, where major settlements have multiple slots and minor settlements are dedicated to specific industries. They do look visually different as well. Now, this is the era of self-contained Greek city-states, of course, but I imagine some of these settlements reflect things like farmlands and pastures and other such activities on the campaign map. As we pan down, the sky, I have to say, is absolutely beautiful, and this further indicates to me that the black figure style is going to be used as the style guide for elements across the board, including the user interface perhaps. We see some resources scattered across the world map, including some deer and wolves. I imagine the former for food and the latter for hides. So let's take a second actually to touch on the economy, something very different from prior Total War games made to reflect the barter economy of the times. There are 5 different resources: food, wood, stone, bronze, and gold. Food and wood are essential for early game unit recruitment and buildings, but stone and bronze are more important the further along we go, with gold being a chief resource. Presumably, some of these campaign map features are trade resources for the purposes of generating gold, but all of these resources can also be found in regions with varying degrees of scarcity. Here we see some very densely packed settlements, and this one is almost certainly a minor settlement or an unwalled major settlement if that's a thing now. And these 3 are barely a couple turns away from each other, which is an interesting thing I'll touch on a bit later as well.
He summons Achaean heroes from far and wide. Among them, swift-footed Achilles and Odysseus of the silver tongue. All mortals' thoughts turn towards the high peak of fog-shrouded Olympus. Even warriors marching to war and slaughter must seek the favor of the gods.
A favor of the gods is executed pretty much exactly as I'd hoped here. A core pillar of Troy, as I mentioned earlier, is the truth behind the myth, and unpacking where the myths may have come from. The gods were relatively active participants of the Trojan War, as the stories tell it, and the way Troy integrates them has to do with people's belief in their support. There is favor to be earned, favor of the gods, and it sounds like this is very behavior-based. For example, fight and do well in combat, or capture enemies and kill them, and Ares will be pleased. Run and hide from battle, and he'll be displeased. Or so the people think. Without getting into a philosophical debate, that's a great way to integrate faith and gods in an era like this. If the people believe they have pleased Ares, they will believe Ares guides them, and they are likely to fight better because they think a literal god is watching over them. This is just one example we've heard about, and there are a total of 7 gods to keep happy: Ares, Hera, Athena, Aphrodite, Apollo, Poseidon, and Big Daddy Zeus himself. Now, these gods are extremely complex in what they watched over and are associated with, or were associated with, I suppose, so they could be involved in everything from population growth rates to better harvests to public order to replenishment rates and the seas that separate the two land masses, of course, should you travel by sea. It's really interesting, and I'm very curious to see how integrated these gods are. I like this angle of superstition-driven gameplay mechanics because, people genuinely believe these things, and of course it would affect how you behaved and how you performed if you thought a god favored you or was upset at you. It sounds like you can choose to please or displease specific gods through rituals as well, and I imagine building shrines and temples will also be an option to gain favor when and where needed, though the destruction and desecration of the very same may incur their wrath. I imagine the belief in certain gods bring about debuffs as well as buffs, so there should be a bit of a balancing act required. Of course, too much Zeus is never a good thing, right? Now again, I'm speculating here, but after a long time without seeing religion be properly implemented, I'm excited to see how it gets done here. Now as we pan across the waters, it's worth mentioning that there are no naval battles in this game, but we're going to see something similar to the Vampire Coast DLC, the changes they brought for Warhammer 2 at least, where naval engagements are fought on land. In these battles, armies that have the blessings of Poseidon will have buffs to their stats. There also seems to be a day-night cycle on the campaign map, not a big deal, but just thought it's worth noting as a possible inclusion. Now, diplomacy itself is set to take inspiration from Three Kingdoms, and that's great to hear. It was my favorite aspect of Three Kingdoms, and it was leaps and bounds ahead of any prior Total War game. It wasn't perfect, but it was definitely a lot better than anything we had before, in my opinion. We're also going to see the inclusion of new features in diplomacy, though we have no details on that yet. I'm definitely intrigued. Now, like I mentioned earlier, it's possible that diplomacy has effects on the battlefield as well as in the campaign map, so that's what has me most curious. Speculation, but I'd definitely like to learn more, keeping an eye out for that information in particular. Now, looking through the screenshots, there are some fresh elements to spot. We see the in-game model of Achilles and Hector in battle with what looks like medium or light sword infantry in the back. We've got a campaign map shot that shows, I believe, a minor settlement very close to Troy and some pretty densely packed settlements up and down the coast. Siege battles will have to be very, very well executed, as I'm starting to feel like 90% of the battles will be sieges. I'm starting to feel like 90% of the game will be going from siege battle to siege battle. I'm a little concerned about that, curious to see how it plays out though. Now, supposedly, actually, since we're on this side of the sea, I should mention that Paris and Hector are 2 of the heroes you can choose to play as on the Trojan side, and they are actually rivals. Neither starts with Troy from the sound of things, but instead, they're gifted Troy by their father, King Priam, on the completion of certain tasks. Whoever completes them first gets control of the city. Here, we see Mount Olympus at night, and imagine this is about as far north as the map goes. This is a bigger screenshot as far as information goes. These ships are either set dressing or indicative of an amphibious battle. This looks like a field battle outside the city of Troy. Either that or the battle maps are astoundingly massive. I can't imagine troops marching from where the camera is all the way to the city back there. We see a Minotaur down here, clearly a single entity unit. We also see an infantry unit carrying spears or perhaps javelins, as well as swords and shields. We see more infantry in bronze armor, it looks like. They're carrying only swords and shields, and we see soldiers carrying spears and tall shields dressed in what looks like leathers. We also see some chariots. Not much else can be gleaned from this, but over here we see the Minotaur, so to speak, in action, tossing back a swordsman who looks to be covered in leathers, while behind we see some more heavily armored and armed spearmen charging in. As we look at the Minotaur, I want to make brief mention of another mythical being that we are likely to see. Centaurs might be the rare horseback warrior that makes an appearance on the battlefield as well. Even though cavalry wasn't a core component of armies, I wouldn't be surprised if we see horseback archers or something of the sort, something that could be mistaken for a mythical beast such as the centaur. Now I'm wondering, I'm especially curious what you guys think other mythical beings might be that get integrated in the game. Like, are we going to see anything else? And if so, how would they be integrated in a way that is the whole, truth behind the myth line of thinking. That's got me so curious in how they're going to try and integrate these things for not just this game, but for future games as well. Honestly, the whole truth behind the myth thing has me very intrigued. Little implementations actually can already be seen, like how the fog of war on the campaign map is an illustration of the map, complete with mythical beasts, burning away to the truth of the era, the actual geography that you explore. These little details turn to bigger things as well. We're not likely to see an actual Trojan horse here. Some historical accounts think that the supposed location of Troy may have been struck by an earthquake at the same time as the siege. An earthquake that people might believe was a gift from Poseidon, one that would have weakened the city's defenses and made for an easier attack on the city. I definitely feel like there's a cool angle being taken to Total War right now. The whole Total War franchise is going through a bit of a weird growth period where it's experimenting, and the Saga games were always supposed to be experimental, and while they were supposedly going to revisit smaller parts of previously covered eras, it seems like Troy is ignoring part of that. It's exploring a geographically small but completely fresh era for Total War. It sounds like an experiment for many aspects that might find themselves in future Total War games. I do hope that things feel a bit more like Records of the Three Kingdoms than Romance if I were to draw a comparison to the latest Total War game, but that's because I still personally prefer the more grounded characters. I don't want them to be immortal, untouchable beings. These heroes, even in the stories, they did die. I mean, these are tragic stories sometimes, and in fact, their deaths were quite important driving forces, so I hope to see that implemented. I'm obviously going to keep an eye out for any and all new information related to Total War Saga Troy. And if you want to join me on that journey, make sure you subscribe. There's always a constant flow of Total War and other strategy gaming content. If you have any thoughts, concerns, or curiosities of your own, mention them down below in the comments. I hope that I'll be able to chat with the devs soon, or at least get a chance to cover this game in more depth before release in 2020. As always, a massive thanks goes out to all of my channel members and patrons for supporting the channel on a monthly basis, and a big ol' thanks goes out to all of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.
What are the children of men but as leaves that drop at the wind's breath?